Welcome everyone to our third Scholars in the Square lecture of the 2025-2026 academic year. Hello to those of you joining us online tonight and in the future on YouTube. My name is Rachel Brown and I'm the director for the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. As a reminder, our sixth format unfolds as follows. First, our speaker, John Thatamanil, will offer a 20-minute public presentation, and then he will engage in a 20-minute period of conversation with Tim Wilburn, a recently retired professor of writing here at UVic, an acclaimed poet and fellow in the Royal Society of Canada. After John and Tim talk for 20 minutes, I'll chair a 20-minute open discussion period. So our speaker for this evening is the Reverend Dr. John Thatamanil. John is professor of theology and world religions at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He is the author of Circling the Elephant, a comparative theology of religious diversity in 2020, and The Immanent Divine, God, Creation, and the Human Predicament, an East-West Conversation. His research areas include Christian approaches to religious diversity, philosophical theology, and eco-theology. He is committed to seeking interreligious wisdom by learning from the practices and insights of other religious traditions, and is a prolific public intellectual, frequently writing public-facing op-eds and articles. He is working on a book provisionally entitled For the Love of Truth, Interreligious Wisdom for the Post-Truth Crisis, on which his talk tonight is based. Now, any conversation about notions of truth, politics, and shared worldviews bring up questions around the possibility of and need for various ways of knowing and being. And so with that in mind, I'd like to say that we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Wasepsan Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And now please join me in welcoming John.
Well, it's lovely to be here and to be in conversation with you. Of course, 20 minutes is an absurd constraint when you're trying to summarize important arguments from a book in development, but I will go as rapidly as I can and try to meet that goal because I've already seen at least some of the questions that Tim has prepared, and I know you're in for a treat, at least there. As for me, I'll leave that for you to judge. How many of you are generally familiar with the term post-truth? Okay, anyone not familiar with that term? All right, so I won't say too much about it. The term rocketed to public attention in 2016, coincident with the many falsehoods that were so common during that particular year, during the presidential election. And Brexit. The Oxford dictionaries made it their word of the year and defined post-truth as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. That's the dictionary definition, and we could unpack that definition at quite some length, but I'll spare you that right now. I should just note that well before 2016, we had Stephen Colbert speaking at length about truthiness. And so he was onto the reality of the post-truth phenomenon well before we had the term for it. We can talk about all of that. Now, I mean that term to capture a range of phenomena, including, of course, outright falsehoods, manufactured for all sorts of reasons, only some of which are meant to intentionally deceive people. Other kinds of goals, obfuscating is sometimes the goal of post-truth. Insofar as a lie is at least notionally something a person knows to be false and then asserts it, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that people who are engaging in post-truth have to be lying. They could just be engaged in bullshit, which Harry Frankfurt, the philosopher, carefully distinguishes from lying, because the bullshitter doesn't necessarily have as his or her aim deception. In fact, a true thing could be said in a way as to obfuscate the truth. And in that way, you could say a true thing and still be bullshit and obscuring what is in fact the case. Now, so much for post-truth. There is a huge literature on this material, enormous literature, trying to figure out what to do about post-truth and how to attack it. For the sake of speed, I'll say that the consensus in the literature that analyzes the phenomena argues that we are in this crisis because we have fallen away from core Enlightenment values. And by this, I mean the Western Enlightenment, not the Buddha's Enlightenment, about which maybe we'll say a few things. And therefore, we're referring to a broad philosophical movement of the 17th and 18th centuries in the West. And those who make the argument argue that we must return to the core values of the Enlightenment period: rationality, objectivity, a commitment to scientific truth. These are among the essential values of the 17th and 18th century. Part of that argument is, therefore, one that names the villains. If we've fallen away from the Enlightenment, and that's the reason why we are in the post-truth condition, then we can name the enemies responsible for that fall away from Enlightenment values. And the customary suspects named in that list of enemies of truth include Derrida, Michel Foucault, and of course, their progenitors in the 19th century, including Feuerbach, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and others. Of course, Freud's dates go into the 20th. What do all of these figures that I've just named have in common? Well, they are in various ways making the claim that for anything that you take to be true and assert to be true, there's something else that is in fact in operation. So it's not the truth of the proposition that is really at stake. If it's Marx, then really what's happening are class mechanisms. If it's Nietzsche, it's the will to power masquerading as truth. If it's Feuerbach, it's projection, and so forth. And Freud, of course, various unconscious impulses. So it goes that these villains in this narrative have undercut the possibility of anything called objective truth, and therefore have brought about the situation we find ourselves in. Now, my argument is that this is a facile attempt to solve a deep problem whose roots actually may well lie in the Enlightenment itself, hence the title of this talk. What if the Enlightenment is not the cause? I mean, it's not the cure for the post-truth crisis, but rather is the cause. And to my mind, the most lucid argument to this effect is made by one of these arch villains himself, namely Michel Foucault, in his late lectures, The Hermeneutics of the Subject, given at the Collège de France, 1981 to 82. In that book, Foucault argues that something unique happened in the history of truth. A new turn in how we established what counts as truth that overturned the entire history of truth and what we took truth to mean and how truth was obtained prior to the Enlightenment moment. So he has in mind here the entire Western history of truth. He's not engaging in Buddhist, Confucian, or other voices. His extensive book, I don't think I thought to bring it in, it's big and fat, starts with Socrates and Plato, and then proceeds to the Hellenistic philosophers, and then goes through early Christianity. And he says that throughout that entire 1,000-year period, there was, in fact, a general consensus that in order to know the truth, loosely put, you had to pay a price. You had to be transformed in order to know the truth. The subject as the subject could not know the truth without becoming otherwise than himself or herself. So no transformation, no access to truth. What he means by the Cartesian moment then is that consensus was ruptured by other conceptions of what it means to know and how knowing is arrived at. So if any of you want these long Foucault quotes, we can send it to you after the fact. But let me just read what he means so we hear him in his own terms. Now, leaping over several centuries, we can say that we enter the modern age. I mean, the history of truth enters this modern period when it is assumed that what gives access to the truth, the condition for the subject's access to the truth, is knowledge, connaissance, and knowledge alone. It seems to me that what I have called the Cartesian moment takes on its position and meaning at this point. And he says, but I'm not blaming everything on Descartes. I think the modern age of the history of truth begins when knowledge itself and knowledge alone gives access to the truth. That is to say, when the philosopher or the scientist or someone simply seeking to know the truth can recognize the truth and have access to it in himself, and solely through his activity of knowing without anything else being demanded of him, without him having to change or alter his being as subject. It's a delicious quote for nerds.
Yeah.
So, well, what else could possibly be necessary than just proper procedure, right? Wouldn't we just get knowledge from knowledge itself? Foucault says, hardly likely. This might be surprising for many of you, for whom Foucault's, depicted as the arch atheist thinker, but his term for what was assumed as necessary prior to the modern moment is, drum roll please, spirituality. That is his word. That is the set of costly practices of transformation that was understood to be required in order to come anywhere near access to the truth in any previous moment in the history of truth. So again, longer quote. We will call, if you like, philosophy the form of thought that asks not, of course, what is true and what is false, but what determines that there is and can be truth and falsehood, and how we separate the false from the true. We will call philosophy the form of thought that asks what is it that enables the subject to have access to the truth. If we call this philosophy, then I think we should call spirituality the search, practice, and experience through which the subject carries out the necessary transformations on himself in order to have access to the truth. Isn't that great? The researches, practices, and experiences. And what might these be? These include purifications, ascetic, these are his words, purifications, ascetic exercises, renunciations, conversions of looking, modifications of existence, etc., which are not for the knowledge, not for knowledge, but for the subject's very being, the price to be paid for access to truth. So he says, and I quote, spirituality postulates that the truth is never given to the subject by right. Spirituality postulates that the subject as such does not have the right of access to the truth and is not capable of having access to the truth. You have to become otherwise in order to know the truth. Now, he says that in the history of the West, and he really means this 1,000-year period, these transformations in looking generally can be grouped into two categories, what he calls ascetics and erotics. Both are vital for him, and both are part of what he means by spirituality. Ascetics names then the disciplines and processes by which we redirect or diminish distorted desires. That's my way of putting it. In erotics, names the work of amplifying and intensifying specific desires, such as the desire for God or the desire for truth. You have to actually cultivate those desires, the desire for truth, in order to have access to the truth. Radical, isn't it? You can't have what you don't want to have. I mean, I feel sometimes like a fool for saying that the problem and the cure are related to affect, that it's desire gone wrong that is the problem. And so the solution is desire gone right, if you will, which is undertaking some process of ascetics or erotics in order to tune up right desire and tune down misguided desire. So he points out that erotics takes two forms. Here, let me quote him again. Very roughly, we can say that this conversion may take place in the form of a movement that removes the subject from his current status and condition, either in an ascending movement of the subject himself, or else a movement by which the truth comes to him and enlightens him. Now, that latter point is really important, right? It's not sometimes all about me doing the work, but what Christians might call grace, right? When truth visits you, sometimes even overrides those corrosive desires to which you are typically bound. And he says either movement, either the ascending movement or the descending movement, he calls eros. And ascetics or ascesis is his word for, and I quote, the labor of the self on the self, a long labor by which the self undertakes self-transformation. Right? So those are the two kinds of work that you have to do on yourself in order to have access to the truth. He's arguing that the Enlightenment is the first moment in the history of knowledge where we gave up this idea that we can know quite apart from your affective state. Now, the astonishing thing about the modern literature on post-truth is that some of the people are really first-rate thinkers, and so they are naming a range of factors that are impeding us from knowing the truth, like confirmation bias, motivated reasoning. They're actually naming desire impediments, if you will, that keep us from wanting to know the truth. I always think about that movie, Few Good Men, where Jack Nicholson is being interrogated by Tom Cruise. And Tom is demanding the truth. And Jack Nicholson says, "You can't handle the truth." and my argument is, and the argument of these researchers is, yeah, a lot of people can handle the truth if it runs directly in the face of what they want to believe. But what's the prescription these folks prescribe? I'll read you the kind of thing they typically say about as the solution. Redlouse and colleagues, this is one of the researchers, discovered experimental evidence that an affective tipping point does in fact exist, which suggests that voters are not immune to disconfirming information after all, even when initially acting as motivated reasoners. Kuklinski and colleagues learned in another study that although misinformed beliefs can be quite stubborn, it's possible to change partisans' minds when one, quote, hits them between the eyes over and over with factually correct information. That's going to do it, eh? Right? Now, they're getting more sophisticated. They want to regulate social media and so forth. But the violence of the metaphor of like hitting people with facts and more facts, and then mobilizing, social media legislation, all the while leaving the problem of distorted desire unaddressed, right? Because the Enlightenment paradigm doesn't think that knowing and desiring have anything to do with each other. Now, for those of you who are in this room, who are part of the study of Christian, Hindu, and Buddhist traditions, all of you know. But none of these traditions think that anything essential can be known apart from transformation. So the therapeutic process by which all of these traditions seek to awaken people to the truth are largely given for years and even decades to what Foucault would call erotics or ascetics. The training of desire in the Buddhist tradition, the cultivation of bodhicitta through the bodhisattva vow, and cultivating your intense desire for the liberation of all beings is largely the work before you get anywhere near the information process. So I think that Foucault is telling us what many of us know rather well from our own religious and philosophical traditions. The cognitive situation that we are in is one in which would-be knowers are captive to desire-generating mechanisms that keep people captive to toxic desires, and the knowledge claims that come packaged with those desires. Before we can counter those knowledge claims with other accurate ones, it will not do to keep battering people with information. That entire way of thinking is part of the fabrication of a certain conception of knowledge that comes from at least the Enlightenment understood as the Cartesian moment. Now, my time is up. I will say there are other strands of the Enlightenment that are more subtle. I mean, even Hume has a richer account of affect. But nonetheless, this sort of Cartesian moment is one very normative way in which we have come to think of what the Enlightenment is. And Foucault is less interested in blaming all things on Descartes than he is in saying that we have entered this moment where we think we can know apart from being transformed. If we remain within that epistemological framework, we are screwed, to use a technical term. So I'll stop right there.
So I think we have you sit here to see you properly.
John.
Yes, Tim.
I'm quite stirred by your project of trying to come to grips with what post-truth is, and I think the urgency in your reasoning comes from this connection between post-truth and authoritarianism. Would you like to expand on that connection between post-truth and authoritarianism?
So this is such a fantastic question for many reasons, not least because many of these connections between post-truth and authoritarianism were named by people like George Orwell and Hannah Arendt well before we had the term post-truth. So apparently the phenomena they're contesting precedes the term. So one thing I should make clear is that I actually don't think post-truth is a wholly new problem that has never before confronted the human mind. There are scholars in this room working on 17th century conspiracism. So we know that, I mean, and my earliest account of something that would perhaps count as post-truth comes from Matthew chapter 13, when Jesus is quoting Isaiah. and argues that seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear, for this people's hearts have grown dull. Their hearts have grown dull. So already we have a kind of scriptural citation that post-truth is not new, and that people willingly close their eyes to things they know to be true.
But there's an epidemic in this.
Exactly.
We're currently in the midst of it.
That's right.
A
Scale problem.
And it seems in most people's mind that a post-truth is a kind of Fox News event, but you're saying it has a very deep history, like at least 400 years. So I had two surprises when I first came into this, when I first encountered this line of thinking. One was that post-truth had this well, deep roots in philosophical history, but secondarily that in this history, the Enlightenment itself was problematic. Could you explain how you see that?
So to be clear, the 400-year history that I am pointing to, that traces itself to the Enlightenment, names why we are in what seems like an absolute dead end, an aporia. Like we cannot get ourselves out of a situation when the situation is being misdiagnosed.
The post-truth
yes.
Situation.
So if people have been shutting their eyes to the truth as long as there have been people, but you had thinkers like the Buddha and Jesus and others saying, oh, no frontal attack of this problem is possible. One has to do some affective labor before any openness to the truth could be established. You had a chance at naming the problem and naming the etiology of the problem. Like, why are we in this problem? With the Enlightenment, we lose the possibility of tracing the root problem because we have fallen into a conviction that truth can be had through proper procedure alone. Scientific procedure or through self-evidence. Like something is clear and evident, clear and distinct to the mind, it must be true. Well, every previous moment said lots of things look clear and evident to the mind, but that's the mind in a corrupted state. So apart from the healing of the mind, there's no access to the truth. So the problem of the Enlightenment is that we've lost access to resources that would help us to get us out of the situation. And then the modern moment is one in which, as you say, we have an epidemic, because what Orwell and Arendt named as post-truth under fascist conditions is now just algorithmized. I don't know if that's a verb, but it's like every one of us can get exactly the truth we want because our computers know what we already believe and can feed us exactly the truth we want to believe.
But if we have been in this tradition, the post-truth tradition, for 400 years, how is it possible for us to extricate ourselves from it?
Yeah, that's a doozy of a question. Might even require a book to try to answer it. I mean, part of the reason why this question is so daunting is that most of the traditions that we have access to that call for something like a therapy of desire, to use Martha Nussbaum's felicitous phrase, about the Hellenistic philosophers. It's a fantastic book. Right? Most therapies of desires have taken place within relatively small schools. Like the Hellenistic philosophers constitute themselves as communities of inquiry, where certain kinds of practices were undertaken by the Stoics and the Epicureans, so forth, right? So, and then Buddhist meditators, sanghas, right? Ashrams for Hindus. These are relatively small scale experiments in learning to desire otherwise in order to know otherwise. you're naming a problem of, well, if the problem is exploded, John, what the heck do we do?
Yes, I have a follow-up to this.
Yeah, but let me just say that one possible solution, this is the only time in North America where we have seen desire transformation happen at scale have been the nonviolence movements, where the goal was not to transform one heart at a time, but King, and then before him Gandhi, and then various other movements, feminist movements, labor movements, and others, have tried to persuade people to desire otherwise, not one heart at a time, but in some kind of large-scale attempt at reorienting affect.
The proposal is bold, staggeringly bold. I mean, what you are envisioning is a kind of mass theurgical event. Theurgy is turning the soul around, interior transformation. What's going to spark it? What is going to spark it? And
My
second,
book.
and second, and whose charism is it to facilitate this? Is it something that the universities will provide? I do not think so. Or the churches? I do not think so. So where will this turn to Nussbaum's therapy of desire? Where will it come from?
So
how will it be maintained?
I have some hopes that neither the university nor the church is utterly bereft of hope on these issues. But I also see certain kinds of insurgent movements that are trying to build capacities. For example, there's a group in New York, I haven't made personal contact with them, called the Friends of Attention. The Friends of Attention. And they are cultivating capacities for attention among people who increasingly feel their lives lost to them. Because there is a growing sense that I cannot even attend for more than 5 minutes to just about anything. I mean, my own attentional capacities.
There's that problem as well.
Yeah, have been utterly eroded since the birth of social media and the internet. And so people are beginning to feel themselves in their bodies ill at ease with the current conditions under which desire is being marketed and driven and made to capture me, quite apart from anything to which I'm consciously giving my assent to. So because people are sort of feeling this in certain, truly visceral ways, the attempt to sort of say, oh, maybe we need practices of attention, communities of attention, are do you see what I mean? It's
I can see cells popping
yes,
up.
Exactly. Cells.
All of us see that through disaffectation, etc. But Fox News and QAnon is just like this glacier that it's not gonna, the cells are not gonna stand up to it.
So I have this naive hope in the powers of the human heart, in part because there's a part of Augustine that doesn't get as much press as it should. And our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. That the heart is in some way innately driven towards a kind of longing for the truth. So there is this desire for the truth innate in us that can be appealed to.
It still exists after 400 years.
That exists under every
decoupling.
possible condition, including conditions of barbarism. The heart is not entirely yet altogether captive. And that might seem Pollyannish to say, but if I didn't think that, I'd be in a whole host of, I mean, I would be in resignation.
One of the great triggers of theurgy is beauty.
Yeah.
And all sorts of beauty, especially now, intellectual beauty, moral beauty. This is not a discipline, this is a ravishment. So where would that come from?
Oh, I mean, that's why I think Foucault has it exactly right. We can't rely on ascesis alone.
Right. He's an Augustinian.
Curious enough to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, his first word is erotics, then ascesis.
Yeah.
Right. So we have to be visited by all kinds of claims upon us: beauty, truth, goodness.
Right.
And I think one of the things that's happening in social justice movements, even on the left, is that a kind of narrow reductionist moralism and sort of pummeling people into subjection to political correctness is being recognized as failure. So there is almost a kind of sense that maybe we've spoken a lot about truth and the good, but we've somehow just left beauty to just lie fallow.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, people associate post-truth with the right, but is there a liberal or a left-wing version? And you're saying that you suspect
there's not just left-wing versions of it. We are all of us living inside entire post-truth regimes. We keep living as though that living within capitalism is actually a viable way of building human life and societies, when we're watching the market literally consume the whole of the planet. And we all give our assent to this. This is not just liberals or conservatives, right? That old saw attributed to various people and no one can trace, that it is now usually attributed to Jameson, but I don't think he said it, that it's easier now to believe in the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Is our collective post-truth condition. You think that believing in QAnon conspiracy is bad. Believing in the capitalism conspiracy is lethal. And so I think we're all captured within, various modalities of post-truth. And I don't want to just say this is a right-wing phenomenon if we're all living inside and capitulating to this mass distortion, which is literally, eviscerating the planet.
Would it be fair to say that you're dreaming of a new contemplative age?
I think that that's not a crazy dream.
No, I agree with you. I don't think it's crazy.
Because the alternative is crazy, right? What we're living in is crazy. Why do I believe this, right? The news media, and we're going to discuss this at CSRS in a couple of weeks, and social media blew up recently because of a conversation between Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ezra Klein. And Ta-Nehisi Coates said something about love can get you killed and was referring to Martin Luther King Jr. Even when a Black man speaks in the name of love, he can get killed. To this very political claim, Ta-Nehisi said something about how his Buddhism keeps him calm. He's part of this vast mindfulness movement that came under severe critique recently, because the problem with much of this Western mindfulness, called Mick mindfulness, often by Ronald Purser, among others, is that it severs contemplation from ethics. But the sheer existence of a mindfulness movement that is trying to reclaim attention and reorient desire, even if it's currently under capitalist captivity, like do your meditation so you can stay at work longer. Like literally, you're calmer, you're less stressed, and therefore you're more efficient for capitalist purposes, right? Well, there are people now at some scale saying, yeah, this inclination towards mindfulness is fantastic, but it needs to be reattached to some conception of what, you know, Buddhist ethics actually cares about, which is, among other, the collective liberation of all sentient beings. All right, so yes, there are exceptions. So we have Buddhologists in the room. But insofar as there is this movement at considerable scale, I think it's not crazy. I think the mindfulness movement needs redirection. But it's onto something. It's onto something profound and deep.
Tim, do you have one last question before we open it up?
No.
Okay, we're good. Perfect timing then, actually, because I was going to take us a little over with your last question, because your questions are so excellent. So thank you for that. What a rich conversation. So now we can open up to folks in the room and on Zoom who might have questions. So yeah, Andrew, let's start there.
Thank you so much to John and to Tim. That was absolutely brilliant. And what I'm just trying to think, John, of how to distill the precursor to the question. One of the things that I find incredibly provocative is, on the one hand, you know, you critique the sort of, let's call it the tyranny of reason, you know, with apologies to Kant, reason is not accessible within the limits of reason alone. You've disposed of that. And then as Tim helped draw out, you also dispose of post-truth from both the left and right ends of the political spectrum. So we've got to throw that out as well. And in that sense, it's a kind of, you're also disposing of a kind of false affect, both from the left and the right. I can't deal with the truth, as Jack Nicholson says, because it makes me feel bad in one way or another across the ideological spectrum. So here's my question. In the mode of human transformation that you're thereby talking about, when one thinks from a civic or political angle, is it a kind of transformation that transcends partisanship? I mean, is that what you envision, that it is a mode of transformation which recognizes that one cannot access truth within the limits of reason alone, and one also cannot purport to access it from any particular partisan stance? Is that how it would look in terms of civic engagement, like a transformation that transcends the political, or at least partisanship? That's the best I can do to kind of capture some of what your talk provokes in me. Thank you so much.
It's a fantastic set of ruminations. Now, of course, I don't think anything exceeds the political fulsomely defined as the project by which we try to live together rather than kill each other. You know, broadly speaking, politics is to be construed so. The amazing thing in the post-truth literature is how clearly some of the smartest people point out that corrosion of trust erodes the condition for any kind of knowing whatsoever. Because I will never hear a truth that I find hard to handle if anyone I disagree with is figured as an enemy. It just, right? And so the conditions of our co-belonging do really require some care and cultivation. And so de-escalating polarization, building communities across lines of difference, I mean, basic notions that are essential to nonviolence movements in general, that really does matter. And the work done by your predecessor on vaccine denial, you're not going to argue a vaccine denialist into the truth. It's long-term sustained relationship building by trusted people that genuinely wins people over, particularly when they finally enter into precarity, like their kid is threatened when they see measles epidemics being, right? And then they're like, oh, but my doctor has never given up on me. I trust my doctor. And so these relationships of trust really, really do matter. And they're part of the larger set of epistemological conditions. Now, what I'm arguing for is not a limitation or elimination of reason. It's that reason has become utterly desiccated within a certain Enlightenment frame, right? I mean, think, for example, of that arresting statement by Pascal, la cour a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît pas. And the heart has reasons? Well, what about the heart's reasons? I mean, this sounds like nonsense from within certain kinds of reductive epistemological frames, right? The poetry can have reason, the heart can have reason. So it's the reduction of reason to means-end thinking, which Horkheimer and Adorno and others also have talked about, right? I mean, Germany, the technology by which the Holocaust, was carried out with maximal efficiency was immensely reasonable, but I would argue utterly irrational. Right? But procedurally, technically, it's impeccably logical. Right? So I'm not anti-reason. I'm just anti the thinning out of reason.
We have a question from Zoom.
This is from Chris. Such a great project, John. Thank you. I'm thoroughly convinced by the salty deliciousness of Foucault as you describe it. The reduction of truth to knowledge has been so potent and so dehumanizing in modernity. I wonder whether your project takes the kind of step made by another professor at the Collège de France, Emmanuel Levinas, who was clear that the reduction of truth to knowledge is also the reduction of other people to knowledge. This, he argues, is a genuine evil. He saw it as the ground of atrocity and genocide. Is this a direction you're exploring in your engagement with post-truth?
Well, I'm trying to write a short book. But Levinas's claims are so vital that I don't know how to get that in the picture, but I hope somehow at least to recognize that whatever I mean by truth and reason can never be made to fall into a sense of capture, right? All of the traditions of truth that I have cited also ultimately fall into a kind of apophasis about what cannot be known and cannot be captured. If you know it, it's not God, Augustine's famous statement. So I'm not sort of wanting to cultivate a discourse of reason that somehow makes us think that some kind of mastery is ever possible. I think reason as driving towards a mastery of a field is actually one of the distortions of the Enlightenment, right? Including the entire regimen of the university. There are fields that we can master, as though mastery were the goal of any kind of real knowledge. Levinas says, hold the phone the minute you start thinking that the other can be known in this way, right? You have captured the other and installed him into your scheme of knowing. So that's not the kind of knowledge I mean at all. So how to make sure I get a kind of robust sense of not knowing into something about post-truth is pretty important. And in that sense, I think Levinas does matter.
Francis?
Yeah, a couple of things. I was thinking about Derrida's essay on religion, in which he calls himself a child of the Enlightenment. And he sees the Enlightenment as being essentially self-critical. It made me wonder what do you actually think? Is the Enlightenment cause or cure? And I'm not sure from your. Maybe I'll be sure when I read the book, but I'm not sure.
Well,
now.
say why you think you sense some kind of vagueness in what I'm saying.
On the
Maybe
one
you're-
hand, the Enlightenment seems to be a kind of narrow in your view. On the other hand, the Enlightenment opened up to all sorts of ethical critiques. The Nathan the Wise, see the other as a person like yourself. Also all kinds of critiques of slavery. And I'm not sure which side you're on, or whether you're on both sides. And the other question I had, which I'll throw in, and it's a huge one, is
because the first one was really small.
It seems to me that there were at least two kinds of truth in your presentation. One is scientific type truth. Is there a climate crisis? What's the evidence? And the other is sort of the truth of what it is to be human. And I'm not sure how these two kinds of truth are playing against each other.
Yeah. These are present linguistically in Foucault's French. He distinguishes between connaissance and savoir, and names that these are not to be thought to be identical. Part of what happens in the Enlightenment is a kind of focus on knowledge as mere connaissance. And we have long had a number of words for knowledge, including, for example, in Latin, the difference between scientia and sapientia, which were actually quite close to each other in the Middle Ages, and then increasingly begins to fall away from each other. A scientia becomes science, understood something like Wissenschaft, whereas older notions of scientia really meant inquiry and could not be sharply distinguished from sapientia. So that fall and that bifurcation points to the fact that there are more than one kind of knowledge. I think my remarks today pointed out that the affective conditions for knowing hold for just about any kind of knowing whatsoever.
So including climate science.
Especially climate science, right? If I don't want to know the truth, that my life has to change.
But there is such a thing as the truth.
Huh?
There is such a thing as the truth.
Oh, I'm not contesting that at all. So, and I think Foucault himself is being read quite in facile ways to say that he's simply denying anything like science or confirmable truth. And even the science and technology studies scholars who have done a lot of work establishing that even the scientific process is socially constructed have realized that their own work has been taken to town by relativists and are trying to sort of clarify what they mean, specifically Bruno Latour's late work, saying, oh my God, people have doing these things with my work? That's not what I meant. Sort of Monty Python. Like, no, don't do that with my work. So I do think there is something called truth. But I'm just saying that even very empirical things that seem just matters of sensation alone, and therefore entirely amenable to scientific processes, don't seem to be. So it feels like affective conditions for knowing rule over every kind of knowledge. If I don't want to know that I live on a globe, I can join the Flat Earther Society. You would think the empirical work on this is done, like you take off on a plane. And you're like, oh, it's curving. And yet, as the old joke goes, right? The Flat Earthers are proudly proclaiming that, our movement is growing all over the globe. Yeah, so that's something about your second comment, right? This is why I made some noises at the beginning about not simplifying the notion of enlightenment. Because at least one way of reading the Enlightenment, particularly through Kant, is to name the limits of reason. What can we know, and what are the limits thereof? So not only that, but there's strong objections from Pierre Hadot that Foucault is getting Descartes wrong. And Jean-Luc Marion would say the same thing. That the meditations are meditations. They're not actually to be understood reductively as a kind of procedural operation. Descartes is carrying a kind of Jesuit legacy forward that we are ignoring and therefore misreading it. So even Descartes is probably not Cartesian in this sense, but
They would say this as well.
Who?
Simone Weil.
Yeah. So what all this suggests is that what we're calling the Enlightenment and what I'm figuring as the Enlightenment is a certain way of reading our historical moment, which might actually be pretty poor historically, but we fall into ways of knowing and thinking, even if the historical grounds that established those ways of knowing were actually far richer. Do you see what I mean? So I think the Enlightenment is far richer than the way in which Enlightenment is figured, and figured as to cause the post-truth crisis.
All right, we have time for one more last quick question, Todd.
Oh, that's a lot of pressure.
I know.
So John, as you're talking about the Enlightenment and as thinking about it as a way of reading history and positioning ourselves again in the continuation of that narrative, I'm wondering if you sense that some of the anxiety we're feeling in this post-truth moment is because of our belief that the Enlightenment, as written by intellectuals, somehow was being played out on the ground in the way that they're talking about it. In other words, that somehow by reading the intellectuals of the Enlightenment, we start to believe this narrative that, oh yeah, this was an enlightening moment when the population of the world somehow awakened to these ideas of rationality, the truth of science. But in fact, and then we're comparing that to our modern population beyond just the intellectual world, and there's this, and that's really giving rise to the anxiety. And in fact, the Enlightenment on the ground looked very much like this moment we're in today.
Yes, and which is why we need more about 17th century conspiracism to have a sense of what was actually going on among human populations in the West. I mean, part of the work in religious studies by Jason Ananda Josephson, who actually has a bunch of different names depending on what year it is. I think it's Jason Ananda Josephson Storm. And anyway, he's doing a lot of work on the myth of disenchantment.
Right.
That somehow part of what happened in the Enlightenment period was that we all became disenchanted, to use Max Weber's term, as spelled out in his vocation lectures. Josephson shows that a lot of the sort of highly rational types also went to seances and had all kinds of occultish practices, none of which could be remotely called rational by any definition of the Enlightenment. So whether there was this, real historical shift away as a result of what happened is a dubious and hard to answer question. But there were political cultures established, including the political cultures of secularism, of constitutionalism, of something called neutral reason, of public reason, right? These were not just intellectuals. This is the US Constitution, right? Which is shaped by the legacies of John Locke and others. So it isn't just a bunch of eggheads. We have entered a certain kind of way of framing our collective social life, including structuring our social life such that it's self-evident to us that some parts of our life are religious and some parts are secular. Some parts are to be conducted according to rational procedure, and some by individual inclination and private belief. All of that way of thinking and organizing space is a legacy of the Enlightenment. So I don't want to say it's just eggheads alone. Those eggheads actually had massive influence.
All right, well, thank you, John. We're at the hour. We're navigating Muslimhood in sport and recreational spaces with Shamin, so that should be a great talk as well. Same time, same place.